Yeah, maybe we'll start. Welcome, everybody. Nice to see a whole bunch of people we know and who are also friends of Warren who are here, including Mary Niesłuchowski, Warren's sister in Warsaw, is here with us today. I'm very pleased that you could come for this rescheduled version of this talk from when the show was here. The show on Warren Niesłuchowski was here in Berlin. It opened in Warsaw yesterday at the Foxhall Gallery Foundation. And so we have rescheduled it in conjunction with that show. I'm Sina Najafi, editor-in-chief of Cabinet magazine and the co-curator of the show. And Joanna Warsaw, the other co-curator of the show, is also here with us today. And we're very happy to have with us today Barry Schwabsky and Simon Leung, who are in the show because in this 1 year of 2011, there was a lot of cultural artifacts around Warren and his life that came out. And two of the most important were Simon's and Barry's. Barry wrote an article in 2011 called The Perpetual Guest for The Nation. And in that same year, Simon Leung's film War After War, clips of which we'll see today, came out. So I'm very happy they could join us for this discussion about Warren's extraordinary life. I'm going to hand over now to Joanna, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the show before we start the discussion. Joanna.
Thank you, Sina. Good evening, everyone. I'm talking actually from Warsaw because, as you said, we just opened the second leg of the exhibition and the publication. And actually, Sina and me, we spent quite some time in this pandemic spring writing to many hosts of Warren Niesłuchowski and asking them for their email correspondence, because for those of you who don't know, somehow Warren, one of many things he didn't do was he refused to write, he refused to commit, he refused to complete anything. But one thing in which he continuously was in his element was maybe this email correspondence and being in touch with his host, with his next destination, with his comings and goings places. So in this book, actually, I'm going to show it to you, and the exhibition, we present a selection of emails with, here is a list, and this is also on both Cabinet and Foxhall Gallery Foundation website. The book was done with the Museum of Modern Art and Cabinet, and it traces the 16 years when Warren decided back in 2003 to drop his apartment in New York and, as Barry writes, go into circulation. So he decided to live as a guest of others. And of course, somehow the correspondence with his host also shows, on one hand, the logistics of what it is to go on and look for next destination, but also it shows intellectual exchange with the artist, intellectuals, old acquaintances of his, and how it has inspired a number of artworks. So we both show a selection of this correspondence, but also we show a number of artworks, and actually it turned out there are quite a few artworks that Warren inspired. So that's the core of both this tribute we made. We all shared Warren somehow, but one thing which was also quite specific is that because he was always a +1 somewhere else, he was a guest. Me personally, I didn't know many other hosts of Warren. So also this exhibition and this book, in a way, puts us together and puts us in connection, and hopefully kind of a picture of his transnational existence comes out of it. And I guess this conversation is also meant to a little bit see which kind of Warren we shared. And you, Simon, wrote in the script, "My friend the war, everyone gets a Warren they deserve." And I thought this might be a good moment to also ask you, which kind of Warren did you get? Because very often this relation with Warren was also a relation of certain projection and conversation. So yeah, which Warren did you have? Let's start with Simon.
I think the answer is I didn't know which war I was getting into when I signed up. I thought I was signing up for one where I recalibrated or rethought desertion from the American Army during the Vietnam War as the center of the war and the center of how I related to Warren when we first started working in 1992. But I think that my relationship with Warren was such that we would have very long conversations steadily over the years. And it developed from one war story to another war story. From the very beginning, I think he and I shared a few things, like, we were immigrants. We shared, the way that I established the relationship at the very beginning was that I was an artist in residence at PS1 and he was an employee at PS1. So we shared the equivalence of a shifter within the larger institution of PS1. But it developed.
If I can just interrupt, I think your volume can be a little higher, please, if it's possible.
How do I do that?
Maybe just speak a little louder. I've gotten some people having trouble
hearing.
Should I
just speak?
Just speak louder, maybe.
Just speak louder, or
yeah,
am I?
Thank you.
Is this better? Okay. Yeah, I was just saying that at the very beginning, Warren and I shared a formal equivalence as shifters within the larger institution, because I was an artist in residence at PS1 and he was an employee at PS1. But it developed and it grew. So from the very beginning, we collaborated in such a way that I mostly listened, he mostly talked, and then I would reframe certain things. So the way he described it was that it was like an analytic session for him. And so the many, many phone calls that we've had in the 20 odd years since, and us working together for 8 years on the film, it was really a relationship where we met and talked to each other. And oftentimes, even though we were going to work on something together, we kept saying we're working on something together. We would write things down, send each other emails, film a little bit, but it was mostly he was the topic, so it was the work on Warren being the work on Warren's life. So that was primarily my relationship with Warren from the time I started working with him in 1992 to maybe a bit after War and Artist in Residence, which was the last piece that we made. And even, the year before he died, we were working on a new piece together.
Barry, would you like to say a few words about the Warren you had?
Yeah, I mean, I find it funny in a way to hear Simon talk about having this work relationship with Warren, because that's something that almost no one had, right? And yeah, I mean, my relation to him was sort of non-directed, teleological from the start, in the sense that when I knew him at first, I don't even know how I knew him. He was just one of those people that was kind of around, and we'd have a conversation, some context or other. And then when I moved to London in 2001, and then shortly afterwards, as Joanna says, he kind of gave up his place in New York. Somehow I found myself still in touch with him, and there were occasions when he would somehow, it seemed to make sense for some nondescript reason, that he would stay in my place. Yeah, there there was never any sense there was any kind of plan or project or anything of that sort that was connected to him in my case. And in that sense, it's kind of odd that in the end, you know, I've ended up writing about him twice, and somehow he did help me think certain things through that I needed to write about, but I never would have, you know, predicted that in the first place. Also, I wanted to kind of follow up to what Joanna said about the idea that we all shared Warren, and I think we can say that if we shared him, he didn't share us. That is to say, we, in many cases, the people who were connected to him only found out about each other and found out that we were part of his same network only, if not when he died, when he became ill, and people started to talk about how we would help him and look after him and so on, and suddenly you start to find these incredibly far-flung connections with people who he would never mention to you. And that was always, you know, there was always this mysterious sense that he had all these people that he wasn't putting together, who he was keeping apart for whatever reason, or he would only mention them on a first name basis, but you never knew what their last name was, you know, where they were, or who they were, or what they did, or why he knew them. But so that was one of the things that was really striking to me about him, is this way of keeping everything kind of nebulous and in flux.
Was there a particular thing that led to you writing that essay in 2011? I mean, you called it the Perpetual Guest. Had he just stayed with you for some time at that point, or?
Well, he'd stayed with me many times by that point. And, you know, he would, if I was going to be away for a certain amount of time, oh, Warren can look after the cat, you know, or he would stay there when I and my family were there as well. But very often he would sort of use my apartment when I was away. And it was, in that sense, it was very convenient to have someone who would kind of look after things when you were gone. But yeah, I mean, I think I just had become very impressed by the fact that he had constructed a very original way of living for himself, and one, you know, that didn't look easy and didn't look, you know, it didn't attract to me as something, oh, I'd like to do that. No, but it came to seem very important to me that in, what can I say, in a world that seems to become more and more monotonously oriented toward production and efficiency and success of some kind or another, at least someone was still able to decide that they wouldn't or couldn't play those games, and was going to make his own way through the interstices of this not necessarily very welcoming world.
I want to maybe say something about certain contradictions that are pointed out by the supposed lack of connection, you know, between the various friends. You know, because I think of almost all signs in Warren's life are simultaneously secrets and doubled. By that I mean, on the one hand, you can say Warren didn't work, but it took a lot of work to be Warren. It took a lot of work to keep hustling for a new place. And he worked a great deal on himself in the sense that, it's a very, it's an extra fancy presentation. You can say that, on some level, he didn't connect, with his friends. And certainly that might be true on some level, but if you just look at the list of addresses and phone numbers and cities, he gives you a very, very clear list of his connections. And you know what I'm sure that I know that he did this with Andre and Jackie. I think Andre is here. And he did this with me too, where he would basically send people emails, but he would BCC me, so it's almost as if, he needed somebody to keep track of his life. And in a way, I feel that my work with Warren, or my relationship with Warren, was one in which, exactly. Yeah, so you may not know who the people are, but you know that there is this very, very, very long list of connections. So in some ways, I think that the work that we did together, it was mostly, about his self-making, but it was his self-making, not necessarily as a narcissistic construction, but an ethical construction in how he how he entered into these kinds of relationships. So I think that the reason that we worked together for so long, in part, was to in a sense pull out of these pull out of him these contradictions. So on the one hand, he would always, say, well, I'm not the artist, you're the artist, or, I'm a helper, as the case with the proof rock, I am no Prince Hamlet, I'm an attendant lord, I would just start a scene or two, I'm almost ridiculous, I'm full of high sentence, and too verbose. But on the other hand, he really wanted to be seen. And I think this deep need to be seen is very, very almost atavistic. Because one of the ways that I think about Warren is that, he was born in a refugee camp. He spent the first 5 years of his life, as a displaced person, as a refugee. So in some ways, the only thing, the most important thing, if you will, for a refugee is to be seen, to be recognized. And I think I said this in another context. And this wanting to be seen, but simultaneously saying, well, I will be in the background. I will show up as a guest, but I'm not, the cause of the celebration. These are real contradictions and refractions, if you will, within his life. And so, we worked for many years without a goal. We just worked together to work together. And in some ways, I think what I wanted to do was to rely on Warren, because Warren relies on so many people. He depended on other people. And in working with Warren, I needed to be dependent on Warren. Even though sometimes he would literally show up 6 hours late, to a session, or, I can't count them how many times I would wait for him for an hour or an hour and a half or 2 hours, in front of a restaurant or whatever. But that was also a way of looking at all the assumptions that we might have about time, about labor, about the 60s. Anyway, so I just want to say that it's always two or three things at once when you take any aspect of one's life as a sign.
I wanted to add to this just a small thing about my relationship and the work you mentioned, and nature of the relationship and the transaction that actually we had. So our show is called Ontological Nomad Guest Host Ghost. I mean, it's a subtitle. The title is actually a quote from Chris Kraus, I Love Dick, and Warren Niesłuchowski was there. So exactly what, Simon, you were saying, she's describing him somewhere in the background, but she sees him. So he's an extra, he's somewhere in the crowd, but he's so visible that somehow in that crowd she describes him, right? So exactly there is this dichotomy. And in the Guest Host Ghost, this is also a quote from his emails. It's a quote from Duchamp and Derrida and the theory of hospitality, but something that Warren very often put in certain headers of emails. And I was thinking about this in relation I had with him, because I didn't host him so much at my house, but I would start to host him at the projects I organized in many cities I worked at. And he would come as a guest of an exhibition or a festival. And in some unspoken manner, it worked in that way that he became host in my name. So he was my guest, but actually, while he was there, he was receiving my invitees. So in my name, he became a host, and these roles between guest and host and ghost actually were performed within our relationship. And yeah, I found that interesting, because we never spoke about it. It's somehow throughout the years, it became clear that that's the nature of the hospitality in that case. So I don't know if this is work or not. It was in the working context, but yet it was more like on friendship basis, I would say. But I wanted to ask and quote Rilke again from your performance, Simon, and you said somewhere, or Warren is saying, it took me a long time to get to the beginning. Took me a long time to get to the beginning. And you mentioned he was born in the displaced people camp. And then he was waiting for 5 years. The family was waiting for 5 years to go to the US. And as Mary told me some year ago when Warren died, in order to get to the US, you had to have a sponsor that would accept you. So you cannot just travel. You need to have a destination. You have to have a family that would take you on. And the family that decided to and accepted after those 5 years to take Niesłuchowski family in New Jersey didn't show up when they arrived. So they had been waiting for it. And when they arrived, the sponsor was not there. So this kind of probably, I mean, it's just interpretation, but this, failed adoption didn't work. And I wonder, do you see, and how do you see, and this is also in Barry, in your text, you're writing that for you, this is a crucial period that formed Warren's life. And you, Simon, also speak about his desertion from the army in '68 and the fact he joined Bread and Puppet, militant theater. So can I ask you about this connection through the being, as we say in Polish, DPs from displaced people camp, and his choice in 2003 to actually go into circulation? How do you see those things together?
Well, I can answer that in terms of the arc of how I thought about it. First of all, I think that there's a almost primordial jouissance in Warren's desertion, in the sense that he literally became Warren when he deserted. So he was in the army, he deserted, he found himself in France, and he, first of all, as we know from the introduction to the project, his name was not Warren. His name was first Jerzy, and then it was George after immigration. And it's because somebody changed his name, and an actor changed his name, and he his old identity was available for a new person to take up, and that was Warren. So he literally became Warren. He became the cosmopolitan, multilingual, extra fancy guest, this erudite being.
But there's a thing,
desertion.
sorry, Simon, there's a thing I don't understand about this story, which is that he took on this identity of Warren from this British actor who is but he took on the first name without the person's last name. And how does that happen? I thought it had to do with the passport and all this kind of thing.
I can tell you that. So officially, he also took on the person's last name officially, like in terms of documents, the documents he used to travel.
Okay.
And then, so it's actually, I know the person's name, but I'm not supposed to say it, so I won't say it. So he was officially Warren X, okay? Yeah. And then when he returned to the US in 1975, he combined the two. So in a sense, he kept his old name. He kept his name that he used in exile, that everybody since 1968 knew him as. And then he combined it with his birth surname. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, in any case, just to get back to Joanna's question, I think that what happened in the 21st century, for me at least the way that I talk about it with him, is that he lost his apartment, and I said, Warren, let's make something new. Let's do another project, because obviously, this is an important change in your life. And almost without thinking about it, and I think it has something to do with the fact that it coincided with the Gulf War, and Bush's Gulf War, the War on Terror, that I just said to him, we can use Kant as the script for this project. We don't really we didn't know what the project was. And that was because Perpetual Peace by Kant, which I had read, maybe in the early 90s, is an impossible text. It's a text about an impossible situation where Kant is talking about what nation states must do in order to avoid war. And my interpretation at that point was that, this is an impossible text. Warren leads an impossible life, and he is in some ways, he is the figure of the impossible. So in some ways, through just thinking about that, when he says, oh, it's taken a long time to get back to the beginning, part of what we're saying is that we are turning one war story of desertion as an ethical model into an older story of the state in which he was born. So for me, the war story at least started as a project about esquisses and self-making and desertion. And I was mostly thinking about somebody like Jean Genet, into one where, he, in a sense, finds that jouissance through an older model, of being, an older, in a more primitive state in which, he renders his identity. Because I think that before like 2001, 2, 3, whatever, he didn't necessarily talk about being a refugee so much. He talked more about being a deserter. It's when he literally depended upon the kindness of others, when he literally depended on someone to give him a bed for the night or for the week or whatever, that these stories came back. So when we worked on the script together, I think that's what he was referring to, to get back to the beginning.
But, in my experience, he never spoke. I don't think I ever heard him speak about the time in the camp, in the displaced persons camp. You know, he talked about his time after the arrival in Massachusetts. And I think for the longest time, I simply assumed that he had been taken from the camp and brought to the US, if not as an infant, as a very young person, you know, maybe 2 years older, you know, who knows what, that would have no concrete memories of that. And so then he never spoke about those memories. But then in the end, when I realized that he was 5, I understood that he must have retained those memories, let's say, of the period between maybe 3 and 5 years old, because you do remember things from that age as an adult. And yeah, it somehow made a deep impression on me to realize that that's the thing he would never speak of, at least with me.
Maybe I can, should we watch, maybe we should, this is a good moment to watch a clip from Simon's film where Warren discusses some of these issues with you. Should we do that? And then we'll come back to the discussion from the clip. So I'm going to paste, I understand that sharing a screen on Zoom is not very good for video. So I'm going to put in the chat where the video clip is on YouTube, and everybody can go watch it independently, I think. And then it's about 8 minutes. So we'll gather again in about 8 minutes, yeah?
Are we supposed to talk
Yeah,
now?
we are back, I guess, right?
Okay. Sure.
Sina, you are muted. Yes.
I think we're back. I just finished watching the clip myself. Very interesting clip. And I have a couple of questions about it. One goes to the question of the tie that Barry has written about, the conversation about the tie being a certain kind of Kantian object, a kind of useless object in some sense, but something that provides their sense and sensibility is what he says. And Barry, you suggested in that moment there's a kind of ruefulness to the way he expresses himself, as if sensing that he himself is in some sense parallel to that tie. Perhaps, if I remember correctly, perhaps useless in some sense of the word, but absolutely vital in another, and providing some idea, some sense and sensibility to the world and the people around him. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. And then I also want to go back to this question about the cosmopolitan and the nomad, and Simon's rich suggestion that his relationship to his own displacement changed at some point, perhaps because of the loss of the apartment, or perhaps he wanted to change it, and that became the mechanism by which to change himself from a cosmopolitan to something like a homeless nomad or refugee even, in some sense. So those are two things that maybe we can pick up on.
Yeah, I think you have to look at the space in between the useless and the essential, though, and the fact that one who may neither be is not essential but also not entirely useless doesn't know, you know, does that make you decorative, or does it make you simply instrumental for some other purposes that don't really involve you? Like, okay, you could say I instrumentalized him to take care of my cat, when I was there or whatever. So there's always some sort of sense of exchange going on, even if there's no monetary exchange. And even if it's just an exchange of opinions, the fact that he was a stimulating conversationalist who you wanted to have around in order to have that stimulus, entertainment, whatever you want to call it. And you can call it different things, giving it different values. And I think, he had a very clear and definite sense that his value to other people was, always a little bit indeterminate or shifting, or, could be slightly different than it was on the surface.
It was who was it who had said that? I think Simon had mentioned the fact that he talked and you listened more, and that's, of course, he was a great talker, but there's also this kind of extraordinary sense in which he was an amazing listener because he had the time to listen to people, I think, so there's a kind of a strange, interesting tension there. Simon, would you like to kind of talk a little bit about his discussion here about the cosmopolitan and the nomad? This was shot in 2011, this particular clip, or was it earlier?
This was probably 2011, yeah. It was shot at Raymond Pettibone's house in Venice, where he was staying with, at Raymond's house. So one thing that you will notice is that the word homeless never appears, in the film, and it's not in Warren's lexicon. So when, by the time that we shot that, we'd had years of discussions about cosmopolitan and refugee and the nomad, and Warren self-identified as a nomad. And I knew that all of these categories were mutable. The guest host part of it, although it wasn't explicitly stated, it came a bit from the Derridian conversation. And this is something that he and I talked about quite a bit, which is that the guest is the host of the host, you know, in the sense that the situation where a host can be a host necessitates that somebody hosts him as the host, right? And I think my contribution to, you know, and these categories are things that, you know, he and I talked about a lot. Nomad came from him. Cosmopolitan probably came from me. I can't remember now after so many years. But one, you know, and actually in my case, it came from my thinking about Anna May Wong, the Chinese American actress who was in, you know, she acted in Paris, not in Paris, in Berlin and in London as well. And one of the things that really struck me was that Anna May Wong, in order to reinvent herself, acquired a new accent. You know, she spoke with this British accent that she wasn't born with. But if you're a Chinese girl from LA in Berlin, working with people like, you know, I think Marlene Dietrich, what you need to sign as, what you need to portray yourself as is that of the cosmopolitan. But primarily, the primary and maybe only desire for the cosmopolitan, the way that I thought about it, you know, with Warren, was that the cosmopolitan really needed one thing, and that is the cosmopolitan needed to be recognized by other cosmopolitans. You know, so you cannot just be a cosmopolitan by yourself, you know. So there's a type of, in those relays of different types of identity, to me, they're really kind of about different ways of being seen, you know, different, in a way, you know, Warren was a shapeshifter, not only in how he was presenting himself, but in terms of how he was seen. And what I think I wanted to pull out of that is both the melancholy in it, you know, the lack of the proper object, but also at the same time, what I referred to a little bit earlier as the jouissance of it, you know, the joy of decomposing oneself and then recomposing yourself, you know. And one of the things that he and I talked about, which made it into a text that he wrote at some point, is pull yourself together. You know, so this idea of pulling yourself together, as anybody who knows Warren will know, is a major theme, both intellectually and just practically in his life.
It was an hours-long process every morning, as those who had him stay with you knew. He spent a long time, so to speak, primping in the bathroom, which wasn't always convenient for everyone else.
Yeah, I would get phone calls about, oh, you know, that little bit of perfume sample that I left in your cabinet. Do you happen to have that? And would you bring it to New York? You know, it's probably something that he picked up, you know, as a sample in Bloomingdale's or something. But he kept very, very careful track of his self-presentation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was Warren's technology.
I wanted also to ask you a question which is actually a question that Barry wrote in your text, and I wonder how you now reflect on this after some years. So you wrote, why is it so hard to accommodate people who are not producing or who are not part of, like, you know, the majority life, so to say? And you use this English expression, I didn't know, the lily of the valley, something like that.
Well, that was a misquote, actually.
Yeah.
That was a mistake of mine. It's from the Bible. It's from the New Testament. It should have been the lilies of the field, and it's one of Jesus' parables that the lilies in the field, they don't sow, neither do they reap. They don't do anything. They just sit there and grow, you know, and then pass. Yeah, I guess I was trying to understand why a thing that, you know, as I say, it's in the New Testament. It's something that's deep in our culture that says that being is as important as doing. But in the present day instance of our culture, being has very little value and only doing has value. And so the person that doesn't seem to do something, you don't know why they're there in a sense. And so some kind of rationale has to be given for their being there. And you know, even the fact that I wrote about him in such a way as to kind of draw some meaning from his existence, and maybe even to kind of make him into a sort of allegorical or symbolic figure of some kind, is my own imposition of a need to do something with him that he wasn't doing himself. And you know, I don't know how to resolve that ambivalence.
And you are also saying that, you know, you see him as a romantic figure, but he was never romanticizing himself, which was, of course, the right thing to do, because if he would start to put a narration about himself, it would be completely, you know, different picture, and kind of refused to also make a discourse. And, you know, as you said, hardly spoke about the camp, and maybe with Simon, with whom he was so close, but not with, I guess, many of other hosts. Simon, would you like to add something here, or?
To add something about, no, I don't have.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I see here in our attendees list that we have so many other hosts, former hosts of Warren, and it would be also so great to hear from you about those questions, or maybe if you have questions, and to Barry or Simon. And Alexander, you had a comment, so maybe it would be great if you start.
Yeah. Alex Nagel had a question. Would you like to speak, Alex, or type it
You
out?
can maybe also show your...
Am I unmuted?
You are,
yeah.
yes.
Okay. Well, thank you to all of you for everything you've done to connect us to each other. As I think someone said earlier, one had a kind of vague sense of, you know, who constituted the network, unless you were able to provide the last names to his mentioned first names. And of course, he only ever mentioned some of them. So what we're doing now in his absence is, I feel it's really important. I think I would like to talk about the name dropping, to use a very, you know, denigrating description of it. There definitely was some, and one sort of, you know, searched one's mind to see if one could, you know, recognize the last name that went with the first name that he mentioned. And I think it was part of a larger host making function that he served. I think, Simon, you're right that he constituted us as hosts, and he knew that that was a position that it flattered us to fulfill. It wasn't so much that the references to some of the other hosts made one feel like, oh, you know, maybe he could connect me to so-and-so. I never really felt that way. But I did feel in a larger sense that he connected me to a larger world, that his world was larger than mine, in part because he was older than me, but not only for that. It was mostly that he just lived a different life from me. He made me feel pretty bourgeois, but he also made me feel like I was productively, you know, making flexible my own life by hosting him. So that sense of connectedness that just the names would start to give was, I think, a really big part of it, and it was connected to this larger sense of having one's life kind of opened up by him. And then on the putting himself together, I wanted to comment on that as well. Warhol, he often reminded me of Warhol. I felt like I was, sometimes I was in the presence of a kind of avatar of Warhol sometimes in his presence. Warhol would call it gluing himself. And I think it took him a long time too. But for Warren, I think it was a really crucial part of the work of being Warren, because I think he knew that it was really important for 99.9% of his hosts not to feel that they were merely doing some form of charity. I think he felt it was important that they feel that they were actually doing something kind of interesting and, you know, enhancing and enlarging to host him. And so I think it was very important, he felt it was very important not to show the visual signs of homelessness, not to be a homeless case that each of his hosts would somehow feel obliged to help. I think that was part of it. Sorry, there's so much more to say, but I've already said too much, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Alex. Simon and Barry, do you have any comments on that, or should we take the next question?
I just agree with everything he said. I don't have any further comment.
Well, I think I just want to comment very briefly. First of all, hi, Alex. So nice to have you here. I think what Alex is pointing out is, in a sense, at the center of what constitutes, at least for me, the continual ethical education that is knowing Warren, which, as you know, as I like to say, continues after, or perhaps especially because of, you know, the death of the other. By that I mean, every one of us, when we see Warren coming, there's obviously fondness because we're friends of his, but there's a little bit of anxiety, right? Yeah. There's a little bit of anxiety about, well, how much would I give? How much can I give? How much am I willing to give at this moment? So regardless of whatever the specifics of our reaction to him, there is built within a type of approaching this, and this is why the piece is called War After War. You know, the way I look at it is that it comes, and then it comes, and then it comes. A type of ethical question that you ask yourself, you know, and in a way that is something that can never really be answered. You know, you're basically always asking yourself, who am I in relationship to Warren? Who am I in relationship to the other? What will I do in relationship to Warren? Because what we know is that Warren's pleasure, his knowledge, he is entertainment, he is friendship, but he's also vulnerability. He's also somebody who's in need. So that type of self-interrogation however brief, that constitutes your almost amygdala reaction to the approach of the other, I think is a very important and continual heuristic.
Before we go on to another question, actually, I have a question. That is to say, there's something, that I have no answer for, but I wonder about. And I wonder if anyone here can help me with it. And actually, I thought of it now because of Joanna's mention of Chris Kraus and how Chris saw him at a certain point. And when I wrote my second piece about Warren, which is the obituary for Artforum, and I decided that I wanted it to include or be mainly made of other people's voices, all of these different networks of people who were in touch with him rather than in my own voice. And one of the people that I contacted about it was Chris. And what I found out is that she actually had two periods where her life touched his. And the second one was in New York, where she saw him kind of fleetingly, but saw him in that way that was discussed. But she had been much more pointedly and distinctly focused on him in Cambridge in the earlier period. And when I wrote that piece, I quoted her, and let's see if and so she said, Warren was living in a barely converted storefront. He was knee-deep with books and flea market curiosities. And the first time I saw it, my heart sank, because I realized that he was probably autistic and he'd never finish his degree or become famous in his profession when he was exactly the kind of person who should. And I have to say, when Chris said that, it was kind of like, it kind of hit me like a lightning bolt, because I thought, oh, I never thought of that, this idea of him being on the autism scale or being, neurodiverse in some way. And I thought that there probably was truth to that. And then that summer, as most summers are the case, I was teaching in the SOSFE Summer Institute of Art in Berlin, and I presented a session about Warren with the participants there at the Institute. And I was a little concerned about this passage because one of our participants was someone who himself identified as autistic, and I wondered how he would respond to that. And then afterwards he said to me, yeah, when I read about him and read what he was like, I recognized that he was like me. He was one of us, or I forget the exact words, but something like that. And so this is my question that I have no capacity to address, is in thinking about Warren and his life choices, to what extent is it valid, or is it helpful to, to think about this idea of neurodiversity as being part of his, how can I say, the material out of which he had to make his life?
Warren thought Warren thought that he had a neurological condition, and he actually partook in some testing when he was in New York. But I think it was some kind of control study, and then after 4 or 5 weeks, whatever, it ended. But he certainly thought that he had a neurological condition.
I think we have does Milada have a question for us? The hand is up, I think.
Well, I just want to say hello. I'm not good in the technical equipment, so I listened to what you were saying. but until now I couldn't even switch on. So thanks a lot. Well, I think it's an incredibly interesting phenomenon, Warren, and I was I was deeply impressed with what Simon was saying, and your Barry's memories are more connected with taking care of your cat, which I also like because it was very pragmatic, I would say, less poetic, more pragmatic. Well, I think it's an incredible project. This book and this exhibition, because the subject is so fragile, so unobvious, and maybe this interpretation with autistic child make sense, or autistic personality. Well, I had one, well, of course I knew Warren for ages, and I read that, I think Andrzej Przybara mentioned that Warren came to Poland after the transition, but while watching you, I went through the catalog and I realized that he appeared to Wrocław and he was working with Grotowski for a while. So Warren had so many secrets, so many contacts, so many unspoken stories. I like, Joanna, I like your choice from my strange archive while working on Tony Osler's project. Well, most of the letters and emails are less romantic than quoted here in the catalog, because they are, we all were begging for his text and for his translations of Tony Osler's text for the projects which he donated to the castle. By the way, I have no idea when piece disappeared. The talking lamp just disappeared, but the doll speaking from under the table, which we borrowed from the National Museum, and new directors of the National Museum, I think, lost track of this beautiful table, which is still in the storage of the Ujazdowski Castle. So I think the way that Warren translated Tony's text to Polish was almost like a poetry. It was wonderful. It was beautiful because both the lamp and the puppet were speaking Polish. Well, what to say? Incredible, completely incredible task, completely crazy idea, and I think therefore it's great. So congratulations on your exhibition and on this beautiful publication. And Joanna, is great to see you, and Barry, it's great to see you.
It's been so many years.
So many years, yes, so many years. So, Joanna, are you available here? Well, can I get in touch with you here in Warsaw or in Berlin? Because, well, after many years of curating, I was fired from the Ujazdowski Castle in 1911. And since then, I'm learning how to teach. So I'm teaching at the Art Academy, at the Music Academy, and I would love, well, if Barry, because last week I invited postmasters to have classes with my students. So Magda was speaking with my students. Now because we all are closed, and we have these classes online, so sky is the limit.
But if I may interrupt 1 second, we have a couple of other questions I'd love to get to as well. But thank you for your very nice words about the show.
Congratulations, really congratulations.
I'm going to write you an email after our conversation and we get together, okay?
And if there's time, we're going to bring up some of those faxes because they were the funniest things we had in the show. Warren's inability to become an assistant to Tony Ursler.
So not only he challenged guest-host relation, but also like artist and assistant. So from an assistant, he actually became an artist.
Different combinations.
Yeah.
Right.
So we have a question from Dorit Sipis. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Dorit, would you like to tell your question? I'm going to allow you to talk if you prefer that, or we can just read it out as you wish.
Thank you. I can speak it out just to be in the flow of voices with you all. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Yes. Hi. Thank you, Simon, for sending out the link to this today. So your conversation about guest and host is always a fascinating ethical conundrum. Brings up, I'm rereading Martin Buber's I and Thou for a project I'm doing, and the whole relationship of identity and the inseparability of I, you, leads me to ask the question or think about you all. You know, if you, who are you? Who are you as a collective? What is it about you that you know, allowed you to be so open and be drawn in and draw in Warren? Given that I know Warren met many more people than those who were his hosts, what is it about you all, you know, on the other side of that continuum of I, thou? Who are you? Who became the receiver, reflector of the I of Warren? Thank you.
I think that's a very good question because, I mean, on one level, I just think it's about who kind of has fewer defenses, you know, or, you know, puts up less barriers than other people. But, you know, frankly, I would always wonder about, oh, you know, like, what about all these people that he knows who seem to be really rich, and why, you know, why aren't they hosting him instead? You know, I never asked, other than myself, but yeah, I mean, I think it was something that just happened on a purely the question of purely kind of personal chemistry or something, when someone seemed to be open to that possibility, he would as it were see if he could put his foot through that door, and then if you open the door, he would come in.
I have to say, I never hosted him. I'm probably the only person in this entire group here, except for a couple of people who never hosted him. In October, I think it was, right, of 2018, he was in Berlin, and Cabinet Magazine has a little office and event space here, and he was here for a couple of events, and I hadn't seen him for a long time. He was living at the time at Joanna's empty apartment, which happened to be one floor below mine, and thus there was a little note slipped under my door one day saying, "Sina, is this you from New York?" He'd seen my name on the door. So I sort of reconnected with him after many years of not seeing him. And one night when he came up to have a glass of whiskey, we finished a whole bottle, it turned out, he told me his extraordinary life story, and where he was born, and the way he ran away from the army, he deserted the army, and then the extraordinary life that he had between 1968. You should also know he's kind of a, you know, kind of a Zelig figure, in the sense that he fled to Paris because Paris was a city that afforded, if I understand correctly, shelter to people who were deserters of the US Army at that time. He fled to Paris, and he got there right before May 1968. So he happens to suddenly be in the May 68, demonstrations, and he sees all these incredible things and even writes about them at some point. And so the years between 68 and 75, when he goes back to the US, were extraordinarily vivid for me, the way he recounted them. And that was sort of my interest, was not necessarily the nomadic years, the homeless years, although that was fascinating too. And I'd read Barry's piece from before. I had not seen Simon's film, but those years, 68 to 75, seemed to me like an amazing possibility of adventure, the way he lived his life. And that was what got me very fascinated in his life and his way of being. A little different perhaps than some of the other people here. But we have a hand up also from, I thought, Andre, are you?
Sina, may I just say something very briefly?
Yeah.
To answer Dorit's question. I look at this slightly from a materialist point of view, in that the people who hosted Warren, throughout the many years, but the state in which he found himself in need of literal beds did not really occur until the 21st century, by which time he had been in the art world for a decade. So I would like to just, point out that, most of his guests, most of his hosts were in the art world. And in some ways, I think that we are particularly amenable and open because we like to keep a spirit of the 60s alive, and Warren was a figure of the 60s. But it also is a trace, I think, of the art world as an apparatus that is not necessarily an economic apparatus, but as a, as a way to be with one another. So I think that he was in a social, and it was in a social milieu which could and wanted to absorb him.
It found an equivalent of it in some sense in the theater world too, right? Between 68 and 75.
Exactly.
Same kind of, spaces were given to him to just hook up with some people, move along with them to the city, be hosted by them.
Well, they're worlds where people move around as a normal thing. So it's just not so strange. If you were, I don't know what, a lawyer, or a doctor, you would presumably mostly be implanted in one place, and all the people that you know and work with are implanted in that place. And the idea of, a kind of journeyman lawyer who's going from state to state and country to country wouldn't make any sense. But, for artists or curators or art writers or theater people, it's part of the general modus operandi that you're looking to be able to move around from place to place and situation to situation. So it just kind of had an immediate sense.
Joanna, did you have a comment before we go to the next question?
No,
Joanna's.
let's go to Andrea. Let's go to Andrea, and then I have something for later.
Hi, I just wanted to talk about this. Everything you guys are saying just brought to mind for me this transition from the 20th to the 21st century. I feel like when I met Warren in the mid 70s, the talk was more about being a monastic. And only in the 21st century did it become talk about being a nomad. And I feel like that also paralleled, I guess, we lived in a group house, a kind of 60s remnant together. And we always felt like, and then when I met Jackie, felt like Warren was our child. And then in the 21st century, he moved more to become my brother. And that actually parallels my relationship to my biological brother. But you know, in the beginning, he helped me write two of my two dissertations. He edited everything I wrote, all the articles, everything. He really did work. He was working at learning all these languages. And then as Harvard was falling apart, we couldn't get him to write that paper, that sociology paper that he needed to graduate. And I really felt there was this transition happening. And talk about the neurological issues. You know, in the beginning, he really didn't want to talk about that stuff, and then he talked more about it later. There was a transition. And I also feel that part of the transition, when he lost that house, when he lost that apartment in the Lower East Side, he asked us to support him as he tried to get it back. And through craziness about his books and everything, we had a falling out. I feel like Jackie and I kind of like you do to a child, pushed him out, said, no, you can't do this anymore. Go find another way to deal, because we can't be the one supporting you in all these circumstances. And I felt like that was kind of like part of the transition from being a monastic to a nomad, that it was from being a child to a brother. I don't know, it all seemed to be that transition around the turn of the century.
Andre, it's lovely to hear that. Hello, first of all. And I also want to say hi to Jackie. I also want to say that Jackie and Annabelle McCall, more than anybody else, took care of Warren in the last 6 months of his life. So, I feel like Andre and Jackie are such indispensable and important part of this conversation. Andre, I didn't know that he talked about being a monastic before the 21st century. But what is very ironic is that he always referred to me as a monastic. Mostly when he came out to, California and on teaching and like literally in the academy, and tending to be a bit of a workaholic and all that, he always remarked on how there are different ways of, there are different models for him. And he wished that he had at some point been successful in entering the academy, and he never pulled it together. But that's quite poignant.
There was one email that we saw close to maybe a couple of years before he died, where he talks about what cities can he live in with dignity on the money that he had, which is very little. He mentions a couple of places. Mexico City is one of them, and I don't remember the name of this town in Ukraine.
Lviv,
which is where
his family
his family was, right? He had family there.
His mother's family. Basically, his mother became a forced labor worker in Germany because she was caught in the street in first years of war and transported to Germany.
Yeah. And then in that same email, he discusses the idea of going into a monastery as another option. So the dream was still, the monastic, possibility was still there. It is now 7:59. I don't know if there are any last questions. If anybody has a question, please put up your hand.
There is a comment.
Comment.
I want to, hi Katsu. I want to say hello to Katsu, and I also want to thank Katsu because Katsu was one of the people who narrated War After War. The quotation from Kant was narrated exclusively by people who had put Warren up. So Katsu was one of, Barry is one of them, Joan Jonas, Amy Soman, Claudia Steinberg, and Barbara Epler. Well, I don't think Barbara did, but Claudia, you know, who was in the scene with Warren, Anthony McCall, several people. I'm very indebted to them.
And we will have some more Warren moments because the exhibition in Warsaw just opened, and later it will go to New York. And at the moment, there is also an exhibition at Queen's Museum, curated by Larissa Harris, where Simon, your work about Warren and your film and other work is exhibited. And we'll have another conversation. I guess you will be the main moderator, the speaker, on the 12th of January. So also please join us for this. And also just for closing of this conversation, I wanted to share just one funny situation that happened 2 days ago when we were preparing Warsaw opening in those pandemic times, and the television, local television came, and they never heard of Warren, but they got interested. And actually not only the journalists got interested, but also the cameraman, the soundman, which usually doesn't happen in this kind of situations. And they were like really asking questions that, you know, how was it, and et cetera, et cetera. But actually they got an impression that we are organizing this exhibition now to show the life as it used to be and is maybe gone forever. A life with travel and life with life of social interaction. And that Warren was somebody who embodied those two aspects. And for them, it was on one hand about Warren, but actually it was like a parallel to our situation. And then I found it really interesting because, you know, it's the opposition of his life, and yet somehow they found this connection of why would Warren now be a great conversation partner for today. So again, he kind of proved necessary and useful and challenging of our positions as he used to do. Yeah, right. And because it's 8 o'clock, I think we will move on.
Thank you to Barry, and thank you to Simon for joining us today. Thank you, Larissa Harris and the Queen's Museum, who co-sponsored this event, and we will see them, as Joanna said, on Jan 12 for another discussion. Thank you all for joining us, and be well.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.